1944. The sky over Europe was covered by dense clouds, harbingers of a storm that not only translated into weather events, but also into growing war tension. Allied forces, with the determination of an increasingly strengthened army, were preparing to carry out one of the war's most ambitious operations, the invasion of Normandy. However, the Wehrmacht, still a respectable force in European eyes, began to experience the effects of what would become a bitter belief. German military leaders like General Alfred Jodl and the high command strategists, thinking their resources were limitless, firmly believed in the superiority of German war machinery. However, this conviction was rapidly disintegrating. The report of a German officer upon receiving data on exponentially growing American industrial production undermined the morale supporting the troops. The production capacity of the United States is like an overwhelming wave, he reflected, terrified by the prediction that in 1 month, the Allies could be producing more tanks than Germany in a year. While the Germans envisioned a quick and decisive victory, the numbers demonstrated an unforgiving reality. In factories like Willow Run, in the state of Michigan, American military personnel were challenged to transform production into a true war dynamo. Allied logistics, exemplified by the Red Ball Express operation, ensured that supplies constantly flowed to the troops at the front, something Nazi strategists could barely begin to comprehend. The sight of over 2 million gallons of oil burned, which would be for them a patrimony of goods and time, highlighted the contradiction between Nazi beliefs and the fatality of what was unfolding. The Allies were taking control of the skies with fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, which proved to be a formidable adversary for their aircraft. On the ground, the Red Ball Express trucks moved supplies with almost mythical efficiency, a logistical dance that spoke of preparation, planning, and, above all, technological superiority. FM radio, an Allied innovation, allowed for high-quality communication, something the Germans, with their more outdated frequencies, seemed to observe from afar, unable to imagine the speed at which the war was changing. With their eyes on their adversaries, German leaders did not realize that the true abyss lay in logistics. While they concentrated their forces on fixed systems that became short-sighted points of reliance, such as traditional transport methods and supply routes, the Americans were redefining the rules of the game. Each tank, each airplane, each truck moved represented a belief in a different future, whereas Germany seemed increasingly trapped in its illusions of grandeur. The fight for Europe was not just a battle between troops, it was a war of production, a duel between ideals and realities. And slowly, the data began to show an inevitable pattern. The gaze of the Germans, which once radiated confidence, now reflected the shadow of uncertainty, a clear harbinger of the approaching storm. Ideological blindness was on its way to transforming into tactical despair. At the heart of the war, where decisions were made in cold and austere command rooms, German leaders found themselves consumed by an illusion of absolute control. The Nazi war machine was revered as an extension of Hitler's will, who believed, with almost religious fervor, that victory was inevitable. But reality, a persistent entity, began to infiltrate their planning circles, like a shadow stretching inexorably. Karl Müller, a logistics colonel in the Wehrmacht, was a man of practical military training, disciplined and above all informed. He had studied every movement, every attack, and every retreat, and although he was a loyal officer, his perception was being worn down by the attrition of battles and constant Allied strategic actions. The sight of truck convoys crossing the roads of Europe, still in broad daylight, burned in his mind. He could not understand how the Allies moved with a fluidity that the Germans desperately tried to emulate, but failed. How do they manage to maintain such light, such efficient logistics? The question echoed in his mind as he tried to align supply lines for his own troops. He was aware that for the Allies, each Red Ball Express truck symbolized a blow to enemy confidence, and what was once an advantage in terms of supplies and weaponry was now becoming oppressive. Miller looked out his office window and once again saw American trucks cutting through the landscape, under the protection of Allied fighters slicing through the sky. A growing anguish overwhelmed him. In the mind of his superior, General von Scholtitz, Operational strategy was confined to the same mantra of military approach. In his office, surrounded by maps showing the location of opposing battalions, he decided how to react to the enemy. The belief that the blitzkrieg could be sustained by unwavering momentum was entrenched in the heart of the German army. "We must move before they integrate," he repeatedly asserted, ignoring growing evidence that the Allies were not just reacting, but attacking with howling self-confidence and an abundance of war material. Secret research by the Abwehr, German military intelligence, showed a remarkable quantity of Allied supplies that were not only maintained but constantly reallocated and optimized through rigid tracking systems. But the unbreakable nature of Nazi dogma allowed no room for doubt. Müller found himself in an uncomfortable dilemma, realizing that his army was tied to an outdated structure, while the Americans were developing new technologies that were becoming the front line of modern logistics. FM radio allowed communication between units to become almost instantaneous, while Germany still relied on more archaic methods, causing an unsustainable delay in troop coordination. During one of the tactical meetings with the High Command, a phrase from Müller echoed in the room. "We are playing a game of chess and the enemy has changed the rules." His superiors stared at him with expressions etched with disbelief and scorn. "We are crushing the enemy. We must keep the faith," a general retorted at a level of delusion that seemed to border on insanity. The memories of the initial victories in the war were fading like leaves blown by the autumn wind, their blitzkrieg successes remaining only as old feats. Now, as the Allies consolidated their attacking power, the illusion of control was dismantling. The contrast became palpable. The frenetic movement of industrial production in the United States contrasted with the rigid hierarchical structures of the Wehrmacht. The notion that victory was simply a matter of numerical strength was in the process of collapse, being replaced by a more complicated revelation. War was not just a battle of muscle. It was primarily a matter of efficiency and logistics. In fact, the lenient words of an American prisoner of war echoed in Müller's mind, as the American team dominated the supply show with brutal simplicity. "When you're in a tank, you don't want to wait hours for a bit of fuel," the prisoner had said, laughing. "What matters is that they have so much gasoline that if we want, we just need to refuel and go. Meanwhile, you just have to wait for the next delivery." This reality shamed Müller, who felt the weight of what could have been information and understanding, but which was now completely inaccessible to him. The prisoner's words hammered in his mind. "Waste is a word in your dictionary. For us, waiting is a lost war." It was true. As German supply lines became more stifled and material ran short, with the death certificate of entire units approaching inexorably, the inertia of a once victorious model became damning. Müller was feeling the cold breath of inefficiency at a time when urgency should have been the watchword. Finally, on a stifling night, with a sky laden with heavy clouds over Berlin, Müller began to draw up plans. All his years of service focused on the reality that the true fight was beyond the battlefield. To survive in such an engineered scenario, he would need to be part of a radical re-evaluation of his deepest beliefs. The bonfires of failure burned around him. The once powerful fortress now showed itself full of fissures. And, as a new dawn broke today, he soon realized control was an illusion, and the war continued to rewrite itself daily. The next morning, the pale sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the High Command headquarters in Berlin. The air was dense, as if even the atmosphere was aware of the weight of the decisions that needed to be made. Müller sat at the table, surrounded by faded maps and hasty notes. The administration's order was clear. The Reich's logistics were collapsing, and their ramifications cut like sharp knives into a body already bleeding internally. He looked at the faces of the officers around him. Each of them struggled against their own devotion to the regime as the terror of defeat grew in their minds. Limits were challenged. The effectiveness of alliances had become a distant echo. The reality was more than a compromised supply line. It was a sign that victory was far from certain, and the war of material increasingly shifted in favor of the Allies. Müller recalled a particular scene: American men and women assembling the production line in airplane factories. The hum of machines, the precision of the workers, the choreographed dance of productivity, all building an air power that defied strategic logic. The production of the P-47 Thunderbolt, a robust airborne machine, became a legend in itself. With a powerful engine and almost unlimited resources, Allied pilots were equipped to dominate the skies, while their own air force could barely lift from their seats. The silence in the room was broken by an alarming report, highlighting the escalation in losses. Müller read aloud, his voice choked by the gravity of the situation. The Red Ball Express runs have cut at least 3,000 tons of military supplies per day, while our lines are cut. We are producing less than we need. A growing murmur of disbelief spread through the room. "How is this possible?" exclaimed an officer. "We have 20 years of war experience. These aren't just numbers, these are men fighting and dying." The frustration was palpable. Müller, with a touch of courage, drew attention to a crucial point. Experience is not enough if resources are not within our reach. Logistics is the heart that feeds any military operation. Without fuel, without ammunition, without supplies, we are nothing more than a drifting boat. He felt the weight of his words and the agony arising from the inexorable truth, but pride would not allow anyone to admit such a monumental error. Instead, the room discussed alternatives. A two-front offensive, the audacity of a southern attack. However, each proposal quickly dissipated when confronted with the absence of resources. Nervousness began to infiltrate the conversations, while an almost palpable unease spread like a miasma. Müller realized that decisions could not be merely reactive, even if it required a drastic re-evaluation of their approach. He began to move his fingers over the map, outlining a new supply route. Perhaps they could establish an alternative supply line, a shortcut that could bypass existing problems. However, this would require a resource that the Allies were using with mastery: speed. Facing the tired faces, he concluded the meeting. "We need to act. The next battle will not be a matter of military might, but of how we manage our logistics. If we don't act fast, what remains of us will be nothing more than a forgotten page in history." Deep down, he knew the truth was becoming a devastating burden. War was no longer a choice. It was a condemnation, a blank canvas where their hopes were painted with frustration and despair. He could no longer point fingers or look for culprits, as the war had transformed far beyond the simple act of fighting. And as the smoke of battle dissipated, the real fight was a challenge that not even humanism could bear: the fight against the relentless efficiency of their opponents. As the sun dawned on the horizon, casting its first rays over the devastated fields of Normandy, the harsh reality of war expanded into a new dimension. The breeze carried the scent of smoke and destruction, while the essence of a new chapter formed under watchful eyes. Müller, in his office in Berlin, deep in thought, felt like a captain of a ship about to collide with an invisible iceberg. The pressure was unbearable. He felt that with each minute lost, the complex machinery of Allied logistics moved with greater speed. Allied planners were working tirelessly like a Swiss clock to ensure the continuous insertion of supplies to the front line. What once seemed a risky maneuver had transformed into an almost unbeatable advance. The so-called Red Ball Express, a specially established highway system, and the production capacity of the American industry behind it meant that the enemy not only supplied their troops, but did so in unsettling volumes. It was as if their resources emerged from a cataclysm, an inexhaustible source gushing into the hands of the soldiers. Müller looked once again at the map strategically positioned on his desk. Rapid access and efficient distribution had become watchwords for the Allies. Every agreement signed between factories producing trucks and the allocation of resources to railway lines created a flow that overwhelmed the rest of the world in a sea of supplies. In comparison, he remembered his own war industry, which suffered from its inability to keep up. Each time a new report reached him, more and more units of spare parts and supplies failed to reach the battlefields. In the Wehrmacht, officers began to discuss the reality of the situation in hushed tones. A whisper of uncertainty was palpable in meetings around polished wooden tables, where victories were once debated. A young lieutenant, Klaus, hesitantly raised his hand, his fleeting gaze alternating between the table and the faces of the high-ranking officers surrounding him. What if the Allies start advancing on multiple fronts? What will we do then? They already have an advantage in supplies and troops, and if we don't have a clear path, what will be our response? The question echoed in the room, making the officer's blood boil. He had touched on a critical point. Logistics not only sustained an army, it defeated it. While the leaders tried to formulate answers, Müller remembered the words of his ailing colleague, a bitter truth. Logistics is the heart that feeds any military operation. Without fuel, without ammunition, without supplies, we are nothing more than a drifting boat. And reality revealed itself more clearly each day. At this point, Müller made a decision. He needed a solution, something that would challenge expectations and the status quo of what they believed was possible. Then, with a firm voice, he announced, "We will establish new supply routes. Packaging and transport must be optimized. We need to regain the control we lost on the roads. Our vehicles are capable, but route redundancy and communication security must be top priority." However, behind this resolution lay an ineffable sense of urgency. Factories were operating in decline, and frontline soldiers were becoming increasingly desperate as the American ability to mobilize rapidly inevitably became visible on the front line. The Allies were better trained, better armed, and had a production system that could transform mud and pain into military might. While the American radicals increased their operations on the front line, Müller worried about drawing maps showing combat areas that had changed hands, the sequence of events that culminated in destruction. He felt his mind on the pages of a diary, a contrasting reflection between two conflicting ideologies. War is not just a battlefield. It is a territory of the mind, and speed will be our greatest enemy. If we don't understand that, whether we are here or there, it will be of no use. Finally, a tense silence filled the room as each officer assimilated the gravity of Müller's statement. The words became a blade, cutting through the fog of illusions that surrounded the reality of the war. He could feel the gazes of his colleagues, a mix of mistrust, hope, and disbelief. There was a point where inspiration needed to transform into action, and quickly. With the distant sound of American engines roaring in the field, battle approached not only in a physical sense, but victorious in an invisible aspect, and the irony became increasingly clear. While the Allies expended resources in an incessant flow of supplies, every Wehrmacht man was a clog in the production line of an ongoing shipwreck. The fight for survival began to unfold, not on the battlefield, but at the planning tables where incapacity seemed to settle. A new kind of battlefield, where victory would not be delineated from strength, but from the rapid transformation of logistics into an art of war. "We cannot afford to stand idly by while they turn their gears," Müller concluded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where smoke mingled with the clouds. The next phase of the conflict was not merely a repetition of armed battles, but a cycle of real-time logistical strategy. The race for supremacy was about to intensify, and the true battle was not one of strength, but of efficiency, galvanized by a system that stopped for nothing. If we don't act now, we will be quickly forgotten. The urgency of his words vibrated through the walls, as the room prepared for a fight that was rapidly becoming the sole reason for their existences in the cold trenches of war. Müller knew that, like a complex machine, his courage and agility would be tested at every step. And deep down he had a clear understanding. The war had already transformed into a falling automobile, once in motion, difficult to stop. General Müller was not a man given to dramatics, but the words he uttered echoed across various German armed forces operations tables, creating echoes of anguish among officers who once trusted in the invincibility of the Reich. His visions about what was unfolding in American warehouses and factories shook the foundation of ingrained beliefs. The eyes of military leaders became harbors of concern as mornings began to unfold into a palpable tension. In the back of a Luftwaffe facility, where the smell of oil and metal mingled with the gutter of a story yet untold, a group of engineers was gathered. The heat of the flames in the melting furnaces made the environment unbearable, and the words circulating were even more suffocating. The lack of fuel was a constant topic, a snake slithering under the skin of every man who risked his life to develop weapons. An officer, Captain Weber, examined a report on yellowed paper. The words Red Ball Express and Allied logistical advance made him uneasy. American logistics was not just a weakness, it was an invisible thread pulling the strings of war, orchestrating a symphony of supplies at a relentless pace. The Americans' stupid confidence in their own machines is what will keep us in the game. If only, Weber murmured, frustration dissolving into a whisper. At the same time, he barely perceived how his own belief was becoming an empty echo. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, at the Willow Run factory, the symphony of engines and machines transformed into a sonic impact that reverberated in every bead of sweat shared by the workers. The assembly lines were in continuous motion, and American engineers moved like bureaucrats of an invisible army, committed to a singular goal: to produce 8,000 B-24 Liberator bombers per month, a staggering number which echoed in the mind of every Wehrmacht officer. For each new aircraft produced, the pressure on German forces increased. In Berlin, the high commanders were in a frantic cycle of meetings, trying to maintain a facade of optimism. Müller's hands twisted nervously under the table as he looked at the faces of his colleagues. One bomber for every 1,000 men. This is what we are facing. He was conscious of the reality that technology was creating. The words of his comrades became a mantra as they analyzed graphs and reports showing the incessant production of the enemies. An officer, with a countenance constrained by doubt, turned to Müller. "We need a plan, General. Time is something we can no longer ignore. American supplies flow like a river. We need to find a way to contain them." Müller nodded slowly, uncertainty filling the environment. The sight of his division being outmatched by those robust Allied vehicles and the logistical support from the Red Ball Express made his nights restless and nightmares frequent. The defeats in Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge were not mere statistics. They were open wounds that would not easily heal. Meanwhile, in a frontline warehouse, a group of German soldiers was distributing ammunition and weapons. At the same time, one of the men, Captain Richter, watched the horizon to the east. American soldiers were better equipped, and the availability of amenities in their camps was a stark contrast to their own arid and scarce scenario. The clear sky made the anguish seem even crueler, as young soldiers were fed field intelligence and supplies that the Germans could barely dream of. Upon seeing a truck supplying an Allied camp, and knowing that American soldiers even had ice cream to cool off, a mix of frustration and anger formed in his heart. They have everything they need. "And us?" Richter yelled in anger, his voice exploding into the air, breaking any silence around. He knew that the idea of a strategic misstep also led to a fatal error. The old boasts, the stories that always extolled German efficiency, became distant memories under the shadow of a new despair. Müller, on a random afternoon of exhausting meetings, began to form a concept in which German logistics could be reformulated. We need to strike a blow to their minds. What we can do is try to divert their supplies, attack their logistical operations, exploit the weaknesses of their supply routes. The men in the room stirred with this new strategy. Even if resources were scarce, determination could lead to action, even amidst scarcity. The echo of the war spirit seemed to grow as Müller's words closed into a kinetic circle. The fear of defeat was still palpable, but he began to ignite a flame of hope. American trucks continued to roll, supplied by an infrastructure that functioned like a well-oiled machine. Every gallon of gasoline, every piece of equipment, all were parts that moved a complex gear. While Müller faced a dilemma in his thoughts, the American mindset had just presented results that contradicted the most optimistic expectations. The army was moving through a new cycle, a dynamic where brute force would need to adapt to remain relevant. The hours advanced, and the mist in the cemetery-like substances of war began to dissipate. The fight now was not between two armed armies, but between colliding realities. Visions of the past clashed with a future that could not be ignored, and the most underestimated obstacle was the very originator of war. Logistics, which had become undeniable, eventually engulfing everyone involved, and the dreams of a 1,000-year Reich. The siege tightened. Andrade was right. This new battle would not rest until every American cog, having its presence on European lands, succumbed in an immeasurable effort that history was never ready to forget. And in the shadow of this struggle, the harsh reality settled. War was shaped not so much by the strength of arms, but by industrial and logistical prowess. And behind this transformation, a dark secret arose. German doubt began to become a growing belief. On the battlefield, the perspective of German soldiers was increasingly distorted. Disillusioned, they watched from the depths of their trenches the endless columns of American vehicles advancing, like an overwhelming wave that spared none, not even their most hidden fears. The gears of the Allied army turned with impressive efficiency, while in their minds a single question echoed: how were they succeeding? Day dawned slowly over the front line, but the fog didn't just envelop the field. There was a cloak of confusion enveloping the German leadership. Colonel Hans Becker, a respected strategist, sat at a table in an unchanging barracks lit by dim lamps. The meeting was scheduled to discuss losses and the need for a new plan. Between lit cigarettes and furtive glances, he expressed his concerns with a frankness he previously wouldn't allow himself. "It seems," he began, his trembling voice betraying his concern, "the Americans are surpassing our logistical capabilities. We need to understand how they are supplying themselves and moving their lines. In our planning, we underestimated the effectiveness of their industrial production." The other officers, visibly shaken, began a heated discussion. Voices blended, each more anxious than the last, echoing their frustration against an enemy that always seemed to be ahead. Meanwhile, on the American side, a completely different atmosphere pulsed. At the Willow Run factory, the smell of metal and oil was a testament to intense military production. A team of engineers and workers, united in incessant efforts, worked in harmony with a single objective: to create as many P-47 Thunderbolt fighters as possible. The atmosphere was electric, and each jet raised was a blow of optimism against tyranny. William Abrams, a production supervisor, observed the assembly line with a mix of pride and incredulity. "If we can increase production to over 300 units per month, we can guarantee air superiority," he murmured to himself, the gears of hope turning in his mind. He knew his work went beyond just machines. It was about soldier morale, about defense, and about a future that could still be bright. The numbers on the screen showed unprecedented progress. Over 2,500 P-47s were produced throughout 1944, a feat that humbled the enemy's offensive achievements. Tension increased within the German High Command, and the term logistics permeated all discussions. While Becker tried to form a new plan, the idea of a preemptive attack began to take shape among the commanders. "We need to counterattack the production centers," said one of the officers, passion burning in his eyes. "If we cut off the supply flow, we can turn the tide of the war." But irony haunted them. Even as they decided this, the very logistics they considered an American weakness continued to be a labyrinth of obstacles they could not unravel. In the dead of night, as the echoes of a bad day dissipated, Müller found himself alone, his mind clouded by the possibilities of defeat. He walked through an empty field, full of debris and memories of past battles, imagining what could have been different. For him, the idea of conquering American industrial production sounded like a distant dream. The sight of trucks and tanks crossing European borders reminded him of something. Their worst enemies were inefficiency and inability to adapt. In Müller's mind, the vision of war as a conflict of ideas, as a clash between the predictability of a German logistical system and the seemingly infinite flexibility of the Allies, constituted a mental challenge. He did not allow himself the luxury of doubting his commanders, but doubt began to grow. And in that fracture between duty and belief, he found himself confronted with the very destiny of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, the battle for Becker's mind continued. With data and maps spread across the table, he tried to chart a new route, a solution that would allow them to break the siege. "If only we had the same industrial capacity," he thought, but the truth was harsh. Every piece of equipment the Allies were producing was a feat of engineering that challenged the fragility of their structures. Months passed, as the escalation of Allied arms production and logistics only intensified. Germany, with its attempts to reverse the American attack, began to feel like a web being woven tighter and tighter. Victories began to turn into defeats, as statistics accumulated like impossible-to-climb mountains. As Allied troops moved towards Germany, the perception of failure became undeniable. The barracks entrance became a chamber of truth. Hopes for a quick war were increasingly elusive. In the silent corridors, reality infiltrated like a thief in the night. Becker wondered if fate had been written somewhere, if history had decided that the front line would become an extermination camp for an ideal that no longer had a path to follow. In the minds of the enemies, a strange irony developed. The war was being won not with armaments, but with the capacity to create and deliver armaments, something they could not exploit in time. While the Allies continued to militarize their resources and create an incessant flow of logistical support, Germany found itself trapped in a cycle of unfulfilled expectations, a belief that faded in the shadow of what could have been. And so, without realizing it, the game of war was changing, becoming increasingly evident that the initial battle lines were insufficient. Becker and his men could fight with courage, but they were about to understand that the real fight also happened outside and behind the battlefields, in every factory, every supply route, where victory was, in fact, a matter of who could produce more. In the vast machinery of war, the fear of what was to come grew silently, portending an inevitable transformation. On the mild morning of December 25, 1944, Becker awoke thinking about the letters that had reached the High Command, full of promises and statistics, as if numbers could combat the uncertainty crowding his mind. What he saw on the battlefield, men upon men, the land stretching like an open wound, was a living portrait of disillusionment. The truth of war was not just on the battlefronts, but in the mechanical frenzy that pulsed in American factories like a strong beating heart. As snow began to cover the fields of Ardennes, the last vestiges of German success evaporated. Allied troops, moving like a huge, well-lubricated mechanism, proved unbreakable. The Red Ball Express, an advanced logistical network, functioned like a vein, transporting supplies and reinforcements with almost surgical precision. The numbers spoke for themselves: 5,000 trucks, 6 million gallons of fuel per day. Becker looked at these statistics in despair, each one a wall his mind could not climb. On the other side of the front line at the Willow Run factory, the faces of workers passed like ghosts under fluorescent lights. They didn't speak of what they produced. They just worked tirelessly, creating B-24 Liberator bombers at a pace that left German engineers perplexed. One B-24 every 63 minutes, and Germany was unable to comprehend that they had lost the race long before the battle began. As fighting intensified, the tension in the minds of German troops became unbearable. Frustration dominated whispers in the barracks. Becker and his men gathered around the table in the tactics room, where the yellowish light created long, distorted shadows. "They can't keep this up," someone whispered. But Becker knew that the incessant flow of supplies and the superior intelligence of American logistics were a sharp sword's edge hanging over them. It was the very logic of war. Whoever can supply better will win. And this became clearer with each passing day. The reports sent to headquarters were, for the most part, desperate. "We are surrounded. Supply lines are collapsing. Enemy firepower simply does not tire." The weight of the words began to suffocate hope. Becker felt this clearly, like a garrote tightening around his neck, each report a constriction, a certainty that the avalanche of American production was coming. A ray of hope crossed his mind, an attack plan that could turn the tide. But as he aligned his thoughts, the echoes of a distant rumble interrupted him. The sky exploded in flames, and the resounding sound of bombers was heard. "What was that?" asked a young soldier. Becker, aware of the continuous expansion of the Allied air fleet, merely shook his head. A new wave of planes launched against what remained of German resistance. They were now in despair, drowning in a sea of uncertainties. Becker's mind spun, an endless cycle of frustration and fears. The lack of adequate supplies, disorganization, and errors made under pressure became a deafening echo. The cave in Becker's head, which once pulsed with bravery and ideals of victory, began to fill with darkness. And he wondered if there was any return, any safe ground to retreat to. His bitter thought clung to an irony. The war was being decided less on the battlefields than in the factories, where the true steel was being forged. He looked into the eyes of his men, and even they, until then steadfast, seemed to waver before American magnanimity. An army was not measured only by its weapons, but by the relentless force of supplies and logistics, The connection that hung between industrial machinery and the front line unfolded before his eyes, fierce and relentless. Reality, a shadow dancing before him, became difficult to ignore. The fight was not just against Allied troops in the trenches, but against the inevitability of a titanic industrial effort that overwhelmingly surpassed their hopes. Becker felt more isolated than ever, and his certainty that they possessed some advantage began to vanish like smoke in the wind. Deep in his mind, a question pulsed unanswered: when, or even if, the future was still within their grasp.